Something extraordinary is unfolding across the border. And for once, it's not about Trump dominating headlines. It's about Americans themselves, from conservative strategists to ordinary citizens, standing up for Canada and against the chaos that's taken over their own country. For years, Donald Trump mocked, bullied, and belittled America's closest ally, turning Canada into a political punching bag whenever he needed someone to blame. But this time, something changed. The backlash didn't come from Ottawa. It came from inside the United States. From television studios to social media feeds, from Republican think tanks to everyday conversations, Americans are now saying what Canadians have known for years: Trump has gone too far, and Mark Carney is the adult in the room. Across the political spectrum, people are waking up to a simple truth: chaos isn't leadership and insults aren't strategy. The turning point came when one man, Stephen Schmidt, a lifelong Republican and senior strategist for George W. Bush, John McCain, and Arnold Schwarzenegger, broke his silence. His words hit like thunder. Trump's treatment of Canada isn't diplomacy, it's vindictive, childish, and dangerous. That moment cracked the MAGA narrative wide open. Americans started asking the question Trump feared most: what if Canada is right? What began as a frustrated interview has since become a movement, a political awakening spreading through the very heart of Trump's base. And as more Americans begin to defend Canada's calm and Carney's competence, a remarkable reversal is taking shape. The nation once known for leading the free world is now taking notes from the country it once underestimated. Because for the first time in decades, it's not America saving Canada. It's Canada reminding America what leadership looks like. It began as a whisper, a quiet wave of disbelief spreading through American households, media circles, and business communities. For the first time in modern memory, Americans were publicly defending Canada. What started as a few online posts soon turned into a movement. Hashtags like #StandWithCanada and #CarneyForCom began trending as citizens, journalists, and even conservative commentators voiced frustration with Trump's erratic trade policies. The irony couldn't have been sharper. For years, Trump portrayed Canada as a weak link, a polite neighbor taking advantage of U.S. generosity. But when his tariffs began choking local industries, Americans saw the truth. Florida's beaches emptied as Canadian tourists vanished. Auto plants in Michigan stalled as supply chains broke. Farmers in Wisconsin and Iowa watched export deals disappear overnight. The pain wasn't north of the border, it was right at home. Suddenly, Carney's calm, methodical leadership began looking like the very thing America had lost. Americans admired how Canada didn't fight fire with fire. There were no insults, no tantrums, only strategic moves and quiet wins. Carney didn't lecture or retaliate, he built coalitions. He didn't shout, he solved. Soon, even Republican voters began saying the unthinkable: Carney's handling this better than Trump. That shift terrified Washington's old guard, because this wasn't just a political statement, it was a cultural one. Ordinary Americans, the same people Trump claimed to represent, were choosing logic over rage. And as the momentum built, something bigger began forming, a sense of moral alignment between Canadians and millions of Americans who were tired of chaos. They called it patriotism. Trump called it betrayal. But to those watching closely, it was something deeper, a quiet rebellion against the noise. Stephen Schmidt wasn't just another political commentator. He was a Republican heavyweight, a man who'd shaped the campaigns of George W. Bush, John McCain, and Arnold Schwarzenegger. For years, Schmidt embodied the heart of conservative America, disciplined, patriotic, and loyal to the ideals of integrity and service. But when Trump's presidency began unraveling into chaos and cruelty, Schmidt did something few in his position dared to do. He spoke the truth. In a now viral interview, Schmidt didn't hold back. He called Trump's behavior toward Canada vindictive, childish, and dangerous. He said the tariffs weren't about protecting American workers, they were about feeding one man's ego. His voice carried the weight of experience and credibility that cut through partisan noise. Trump isn't defending America, he said. He's destroying the very alliances that made it strong. Those words sent shockwaves through Washington and beyond. For many conservatives, hearing one of their own expose Trump's failures hit harder than any liberal criticism ever could. Schmidt was speaking from inside the machine, not outside it. He reminded America that real leadership wasn't about bullying allies or rewriting history. It was about upholding principles even when inconvenient. His calm, confident tone stood in stark contrast to Trump's outbursts. While the president hurled insults at Canada, Schmidt spoke of respect, cooperation, and long-term vision. The clip was shared millions of times. Conservative veterans, business owners, and even former Trump voters began rethinking their loyalty. And just like that, the unthinkable happened. A lifelong Republican became the face of American dissent, not to destroy the party but to save its soul. But Schmidt's most powerful moment was still ahead, a statement that would stun both nations and redefine the US-Canada relationship forever. By the time summer rolled around, the cracks in Trump's America First economy had turned into full-blown fractures. The numbers were grim and the consequences impossible to ignore. American exports to Canada had plummeted. Small businesses across border states were collapsing under the weight of retaliatory tariffs. And while Trump continued to boast about winning the trade war, thousands of U.S. workers were losing their jobs every month. Stephen Schmidt painted the picture plainly. "Go talk to someone in Florida who depends on Canadian tourists," he said, or a Michigan manufacturer waiting for parts stuck behind Trump's tariffs. This is real life. Those weren't just statistics. They were people, families, and livelihoods caught in the crossfire of political vanity. Trump's economic nationalism, sold as strength, had become economic self-sabotage. The damage didn't stop at lost profits. Trust, the foundation of North America's prosperity, began to crumble. Provinces that had once relied on U.S. markets started diversifying their exports to Asia and Europe. Canadian firms quietly pulled out of joint ventures, citing instability in Washington. It was an economic divorce decades in the making, accelerated by one man's ego. Meanwhile, Carney's steady leadership was drawing global attention. While Trump imposed chaos, Carney implemented coherence, redirecting trade, protecting supply chains, and strengthening domestic industries. Analysts began saying openly what many had whispered: Canada was emerging stronger from Trump's war than the U.S. itself. The fallout was clear. Trump had managed to hurt both economies, but only one leader had a plan to rebuild. And as Americans began connecting the dots, frustration turned into reflection. They realized the tariffs weren't a show of power, they were proof of weakness. And from that realization, a new respect for Canada began to take root. While Washington spiraled deeper into dysfunction, Ottawa was doing something few expected: leading. Mark Carney didn't match Trump's fury, he outmaneuvered it. Every time the U.S. government lashed out with another tariff threat, Carney responded with calm strategy. He built coalitions in silence, reinforced trade links with Europe, and accelerated Canada's partnerships in Asia. His message to Canadians was clear: we don't need to shout to be strong. The world noticed. Carney's quiet confidence began to redefine global perceptions of leadership. International observers compared his measured tone with Trump's volatility and saw a stark contrast: clarity versus chaos. Even American networks started calling Carney the calm center in a storming continent. He wasn't chasing headlines, he was shaping outcomes. For Canadians, his approach was a point of pride. For Americans, it was a mirror, reflecting what their own politics had lost: dignity, reason, and steadiness. Carney's brand of diplomacy wasn't about power plays or personal grudges. It was about protecting citizens from the fallout of ego-driven decisions. Stephen Schmidt captured it perfectly when he said, "Carney defeats chaos with clarity, and that's why Trump fears him." Those words resonated across borders. Americans were beginning to realize that Carney's restraint wasn't weakness, it was mastery. By avoiding Trump's traps, the taunts, the name-calling, the public spectacle, Carney positioned Canada as a moral counterweight to the noise coming out of Washington. He made leadership look intelligent again. And then came the moment that stunned both nations, when Schmidt uttered a sentence that changed the tone of the entire debate. It wasn't just critique anymore. It was a warning, one that would echo from Ottawa to the White House. "Donald Trump," Schmidt said, "has become a threat to Canada." Those 8 words, "Donald Trump has become a threat to Canada," hit like a political earthquake. No American strategist had ever said such a thing about a sitting U.S. president, but Stephen Schmidt didn't hesitate. He wasn't ranting, he was warning. On live television, he described how Trump's hostility toward Canada had crossed a line from bad policy into dangerous obsession. "The United States and Canada were the nations that saved the world in 1944, Schmidt said. "Now we have an American president trying to snuff out Canadian independence." The reaction was immediate. Across North America, the clip went viral. For Canadians, Schmidt's words confirmed what they had long suspected: Trump's trade war was never about economics, it was about dominance. For Americans, it was something even more painful: an acknowledgement that their leader had turned on one of their oldest and closest allies. Schmidt didn't stop there. He called Trump's ambassador to Canada a disgrace, accusing him of enabling the president's bullying and isolationism. He warned that when the U.S. president treats allies as enemies, he doesn't just weaken those allies, he weakens America itself. And his message resonated far beyond politics. Within weeks, hundreds of thousands of Americans joined the Save America movement, a grassroots campaign inspired by Schmidt's declaration. Its members weren't just anti-Trump, they were pro-integrity. They believed America's strength had always come from its alliances, not its anger. The phrase, "a threat to Canada," became a turning point, echoing through talk shows, editorials, and dinner table debates. And while Trump fired back with insults, Carney said nothing, letting silence speak louder than any tweet. Because sometimes real leadership doesn't need to respond. It just needs to endure and let the truth do the talking. What began as one man's warning soon evolved into a national awakening. The Save America movement, co-founded by Stephen Schmidt, exploded across the United States. Within weeks, it had chapters in every major city from New York to Dallas to Los Angeles. It wasn't a partisan crusade, it was a declaration of sanity. Its message was simple. America cannot save itself by destroying its friends. At the heart of that message stood Mark Carney. His composure, intelligence, and results turned him into an unlikely symbol of stability for millions of disillusioned Americans. Talk shows that once mocked Canada were now praising its leadership. Headlines like "Carney's calm outsmarts Trump's chaos" began appearing in U.S. newspapers. On social media, clips of Carney's quiet, articulate press conferences circulated alongside memes of Trump's shouting matches. The contrast couldn't be clearer or more humiliating for Washington. Even longtime conservatives, including former senators and governors, began echoing Schmidt's words. "We need more leaders like Carney," one Republican columnist wrote. "He reminds us what integrity looks like." Meanwhile, American citizens flooded online forums expressing envy, not of Canada's resources or geography, but of its political sanity. While Trump's administration stumbled through scandals and policy reversals, Canada quietly expanded its influence, striking trade deals, protecting industries, and strengthening diplomacy. The world was changing, and the map of respect was being redrawn. The movement that began as a reaction to Trump's arrogance had transformed into something far more powerful, a collective realization that the future of democracy might not be led from Washington anymore. And as the Save America movement grew louder, a new pattern emerged. America was no longer lecturing the world. It was learning from it, especially from its polite, unshakable neighbor to the north. As Trump doubled down on isolation and insults, something remarkable began happening south of the border. Americans started looking north for inspiration. News outlets once fixated on Washington's drama began featuring Canada's calm leadership instead. Analysts on CNN and MSNBC described Mark Carney as the statesman Trump never was. Even conservative podcasts, normally loyal to MAGA rhetoric, began acknowledging an uncomfortable truth. Canada was rising while America was unraveling. Carney's strategic alliances were proof. Under his leadership, Canada strengthened its trade presence in Asia, expanded LNG exports to Europe, and secured defense cooperation with Nordic partners. Each quiet deal amplified Canada's influence, and every misstep by Trump made that contrast starker. While Trump isolates, one U.S. commentator said, Carney integrates. That's leadership. Ordinary Americans began to notice too. Small business owners burned by tariffs watched Canada's economy recover faster than their own. Students saw Carney trending on social media, not for scandals or outbursts, but for diplomacy and results. Even in late-night comedy monologues, Carney's composure became a running theme. Imagine a leader who answers questions without yelling. It was more than admiration. It was recognition that Carney's Canada was what many Americans wish their country could still be: measured, principled, respected. And for Trump, that realization was infuriating. Because for decades, Canada had been America's quiet partner, the loyal ally, the steady shadow, but under Carney, that balance shifted. Canada wasn't following anymore, it was leading. By the fall, the symbolism was undeniable. The world's cameras weren't pointed at Washington's chaos, they were fixed on Ottawa's confidence. And as the global spotlight moved north, one question lingered across dinner tables and newsrooms alike. If Canada could stay calm and rise, why couldn't America? What began as a political feud had transformed into a generational moment, one that redefined how the world viewed leadership, power, and principle. For the first time in modern history, America's moral compass wasn't pointing inward. It was looking north, toward a nation that had managed to navigate chaos with quiet dignity. Mark Carney's leadership became more than a story about Canada's rise. It became a global symbol of what democracy could still look like when guided by reason instead of rage. Across the U.S., citizens disillusioned by Trump's circus began realizing something profound: true strength doesn't need to shout. It doesn't rely on fear or division, it builds bridges, not walls. Carney embodied that truth. He showed that calm wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. And in doing so, he reminded an entire generation of Americans that leadership rooted in empathy, intellect, and humility could still move nations. The Save America movement reflected this awakening. What started as resistance evolved into reflection. Americans weren't just criticizing Trump anymore, they were questioning what kind of country they wanted to be. The contrast between Trump's chaos and Carney's composure became a moral debate as much as a political one. Even internationally, Canada's diplomacy began inspiring others. Nations weary of populist rage started seeking Canada's counsel, not America's. The world saw something powerful. That influence doesn't come from domination, but from consistency, clarity, and respect. And perhaps that's why this moment matters. Because the story isn't just about Canada winning a trade war or Trump losing face, it's about a deeper shift in values. For the first time in decades, the world isn't following America's example. It's following Canada's. History doesn't always turn with explosions or revolutions. Sometimes it shifts with a whisper. What happened between Mark Carney and Donald Trump will be remembered as one of those quiet turning points. Without armies or speeches, Canada managed to flip the North American narrative. It proved that power isn't measured in volume but in vision. And as Trump's shouting grew louder, Carney's silence became deafening, the silence of strategy, the sound of strength. Stephen Schmidt's words lit the spark, but Carney's restraint kept it burning. He didn't seek revenge or applause. He didn't try to humiliate his neighbor. He simply held his ground and in doing so taught both nations a lesson that can't be unlearned. Real leadership doesn't demand loyalty, it earns respect. Trump's tariffs, tantrums, and trade wars were supposed to make America feared again. Instead, they made Canada admired again. Around the world, diplomats, analysts, and citizens saw what America used to represent, now embodied by its northern neighbor: dignity, democracy, and discipline. Carney didn't just defend Canada's sovereignty, he redefined it. Today, as America wrestles with the consequences of division and decline, millions of its own citizens are looking north not out of envy, but out of hope. They see in Canada a reflection of what America once aspired to be: steady, fair, and free. The era of shouting politics may not be over, but its grip is weakening. And in its place rises a new kind of power, one that leads without fear, persuades without force, and wins without war. For once, history's applause isn't echoing through Washington, it's drifting quietly across the border toward Ottawa. Because in the end, Canada didn't just survive Trump's chaos, it conquered it with calm.